Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's CPD in relation to our new Part 5 information paper, part of our ongoing series of CPDs in relation to our new property handbook. I am Micheál Mahan. I'm a chartered quantity surveyor and up till very recently was president of the SCSI. This is obviously a very topical and timely CPD, as evidenced by the attendance today. For my own part, I've been involved in Part 5 in various capacities for a number of years. As currently as chartered quantity surveyor in my own practice, assessing Part 5 applications on behalf of local authorities, and indeed in some instances making submissions for Part 5 to local authorities. So one thing is clear to me, certainly, is that there is a certain inconsistency in approach in relation to Part 5 across the country, and I'm sure today's seminar will help address some of those. Before we start, I would though like to extend my sincere thanks to all our volunteer members who have contributed to this paper, culminating in today's presentation. I do think sometimes that it is just not realised outside SCSI the sheer amount of volunteer time and effort that goes in to make sure we continue to produce high quality, independent publications and research. And certainly, as I say, I would like to extend our thanks to all our volunteer members in that respect. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our two volunteer presenters as well, Frank Harrington and Sheila Farrell. Frank is head of real estate in the School of Surveying and Construction Management in TUD. He has extensive experience in the property industry and a leading a land valuation expert. Frank holds a BSc in Property Economics, MSc in Planning and Development, MA in Higher Education, professional doctorate in the built environment, and is actively involved in the research community. He's a fellow of the SCSI, a registered valuer, and sits on the International Valuation Standards Council Global Membership and Recognition Board. Frank has achieved significant professional success academically and through ongoing professional activities. Sheila Farrell works with Dublin City Council and Dublin City and County Councils and is a chartered valuation surveyor. Sheila has more than 25 years experience providing property advice to Dublin and Dublin County and City Councils. Sheila has extensive experience in the area of statutory valuations, CPO schemes, derelict sites, vacant sites, etc., and has been involved, as she informed us, since the inception of Part 5 in the assessment of Part 5. So obviously started at a very young age. So listen, without further ado, I would like to hand over to Frank now to commence the presentation.
Thanks, Micheál, for that introduction. Just to reiterate some thanks, while Sheila and I are presenting today, as Micheál has said, it's really been a team effort in getting it to this stage, and I would also like to extend a thanks to everyone who contributed to the paper, particularly on the multidisciplinary working group that Sheila and I were involved in. We had involvement across the disciplines, from quantity surveyors and planning and development surveyors, and we also had perspectives from people who acted for developers and from the local authority itself. And we also had stakeholder involvement from various stakeholders, including the housing agency. And really, I think the robustness of this feedback, really helped to contribute to the paper that we're presenting today. And I would also like to thank Eddie McCauley and his team at the SCSI. And as Micheál has said, the volunteer members are very crucial to preparing paper. I don't think people appreciate the amount of work that goes on and behind the scenes with the SCSI executives, indeed, in terms of coordinating feedback from the various professional groups, which has all been very valued, from the valuation group, the quantity surveying group, and the planning and development group, which has all led to this paper. So thanks to all involved, and indeed to Edel and Michelle for organising and coordinating the event today. Sheila and I will be presenting today, and it's going to be primarily on the valuation issues, and it's going to be a high-level overview of Part 5 valuations and negotiations. I will start by taking you through just a bit of context. I think the context is important when we talk about the terminology and concepts that we're going to come to. And then I will take you through some key terminology in terms of Part 5 and those concepts. And then Sheila is going to take over and discuss more on the understanding of the negotiation process from a local authority side of things and the role as a surveyor, before we'll go over to questions and answers. and we do welcome all feedback, as I say. So part 5, context. What is it? Well, as Micheál alluded to, you know, it's over 20 years old now. It was introduced in the Planning and Development Act 2000, and it was a measure to integrate social and affordable housing in all new housing developments over certain limits. So we're all sort of, I'm sure, on some level aware of that, but it's important to sort of keep that in mind when we're thinking about the concepts that we're going to look at in the next few slides. And why was it introduced in the first place? Well, the state provides the services and grants planning on the land, and we as surveyors and valuers are very consciously aware that when planning is granted on land, it adds value to land. So I suppose part 5 provides a measure to capture part of this planning gain. You might recall going back even further to the Kenny report, it's sort of a compromise on Kenny, and some people would consider it in that kind of context. Secondly, though, and perhaps more specifically, it's about developing integrated housing. And I'm not going to go through these quotes specifically, but they give some idea of why integrated housing is important, you know, in a housing policy strategy. We're all keenly aware of the housing crisis that we have and measures that are needed to address the delivery of social and affordable housing throughout Ireland. And what part 5 does is it's a measure to allow this to be done in an integrated way, which is quite important, as we're all, I'm sure, aware of, trying to avoid mistakes of the past in terms of segregation. So it provides a measure to allow social and potentially affordable, in the past it was, we'll come back to that, to be developed, to be integrated into all new housing developments over certain limits. So in terms of the legislative context, again, this would be a CPD in its own right, so I'm just going to go over this at a very high level. Part 5 was introduced as part of the Planning and Development Act 2000, as we've referenced, and there's been various challenges and amendments to it over the years. Some of the significant amendments are referenced here with the Planning and Development Act 2002, the Planning and Development Act 2010, and the Urban Regeneration and Housing Act 2015. So they brought in various measures, different ways to comply with Part 5. They've brought in more recently, they've reduced the 20% initial limit down to 10%. And they have introduced measures like allowing leasing rather than just pure purchase. As I said, I'm not going to go through the detail of it today, but what I have provided here is a link to a consolidated version of the Act, which is quite useful. It's up to early in 2021. And you can look at that link in terms of bringing together all of the acts if you're looking for any detail on Part 5 and the legislative context. So it's quite important to be familiar with that. I've also just put in a link here to the 2021 bill, which is at Shannon stages. So the reason I put that in is, I suppose we're presenting all of this information with a big caveat. There is a lot of discussions around changes to Part 5. As Michael said, it's quite timely. And we were, as a working group, we were quite aware of this while we're preparing it. It's still in discussions and there's nothing formally been agreed on this. But there has been discussions about, within the programme for government, of increasing the Part 5 component up to 20%. So just bear in mind with the timeliness of this CPD that if you are involved in the process down the line to be aware of what the latest legislation is in that context. And before I move on from this slide as well, just to acknowledge the contribution of Dr. Peter Stafford on the working group, who's an external member but formerly of this parish in the SCSI, that he was Director of Research in the SCSI, and he's now a barrister at law, and he was very helpful in terms of the working paper on Part 5 and these elements. And then the legislative context brings us to some of this key terminology that is defined in the Act. And partly because of the changes over the years, there has been quite a few changes to terminology, which has caused a little bit of confusion throughout the years. So hopefully this will help explain it a little bit. We as valuers are very aware of assumptions that underpin our evaluations. And with Part 5, it's no different. Part 5 is a statutory instrument, so it's exempt from the Red Book. So we've got slightly different terminology, and that's why I've put a little asterisk there beside open market value. But just to start off with the existing use value, because it's often one that troubles valuers. It's defined in the Act as the value of land calculated by reference to the date that planning permission was granted on the basis that it would have been unlawful to carry out any development on that land other than exempted development. So we're working under this assumption that no development can occur on whatever asset or value or property you're valuing. So if this is a greenfield site, it's fairly straightforward. We're looking at a greenfield site, and even if planning permission is attached, we're going to ignore it. But if it's not a greenfield site, you know, if we're looking at a higher value use, like for example a pub, or you know that might have a planning permission attached to it for residential development, then we would value the existing use as we would normally value it in terms of the existing use as a pub, with the fact that it's unlawful to carry out any other exempted development like a residential development. So you're valuing the actual use that's in there. So that's what the existing use valuation is. The open market value, as I say, it's slightly different terminology in terms of statutory valuations than we'd be used to in terms of market value, but fundamentally it's the same. You know, it can be treated similarly as a market value valuation, and it's the value of land property at a date that planning was granted with the benefit of planning permission for the residential development attached. And to add sort of further complications to it, it's often referred to as the development value. So development value and market value are largely used interchangeably. You would value it as you would value development land. And Sheila will get into this a little bit later in terms of comparables, or you know, supplementing it with other models. And then that leads on to the net monetary value, which again has changed over the years, but it is the uplift in the existing use value of the land due to the grant of planning permission for residential development. And Part 5 enables the local authority to capture a portion, currently at 10%, of that uplift. And I again reiterate, currently at 10%, given the context of the legislative framework. Just to put this in more concrete examples, just to give you an example, and I'm talking generally here, not about an ongoing case or anything, but this is an example of land here, a greenfield site, that you might initially look at and think that it's just purely greenfield, and the existing use value should be agricultural values, or whatever the case may be on that. And it could be, you know, if there's actually about 6.5 acres in this plot, you know, and it's in a good location, which could get up to 15 an acre, could be in around 90 to 100,000 in terms of that. But you will see, if you can see my cursor highlighting over, there is actually a house here. So the house on this land, a house on 6.5 acres in this context, could be worth €1 million, you know, or in and around that. So a substantial difference. So we need to be very mindful of what's on it and the use. And obviously, again, as I say, if it's a higher use, you would go higher. So that's the existing use. And then the open market value, if you see the diagram on the right, or the zoning map on the right, we use the zoning map as there's no planning permission granted on it. It's not a case that's ongoing. It's the value with the development potential, with the planning permission as of that date of planning. And Sheila will get into the more detail on the concepts of exactly what's to be valued there. So to put that in context of net monetary value, on this graph, and to illustrate it, you've got on the left the open market value or development value of a piece of ground, and let's just for round figures say it was 3 million, and the existing use value was 1 million. The net monetary value, or the planning gain here, is 200,000. You've got a net monetary value of 3 million minus the 1 million is equal to 2 million. It's sort of the planning gain because of the grant of planning. And as we say, Part 5 tries to capture a piece of this, going back to the context that I alluded to in the earlier slides. So that's currently at 10%. So the net monetary value for Part 5 at 10% is 200,000. So what that figure represents is the figure of a contribution that you should be giving to the local authority. In years gone by, when you were allowed to write a check to comply with your Part 5 requirements, the developer would write a check for that amount. Obviously, it has to be done through units now. And the next slide just gives an example of how these Part 5 valuations would impact in practice, and sort of a cross-check mechanism as well. So taking that example on and just assuming and making this assumption that there's 50 units in that particular example, you would have an open market value of 3 million, and divided by 50, that would be 60,000 euro site. You have an existing use value of 1 million, and divided by 50, that's 20,000 per site. And in practice, this is a key figure, the 20,000 per site, because the 20,000 per site represents the site value that you can claim from the local authority in terms of your costs. So you can claim 20,000 euro per site in this particular instance, on top of your standard building costs plus your margin when you're putting in your claim. So that's a key figure. So this on the left just shows what we've gone through previously. The 2 million by 10% is 200,000. But in terms of practice, if we're talking about delivering of a scheme of 50 units at a Part 5 rate of 10%, proposing to the local authority that we will give them 10% of the units, and that being 5, how do we make up this 200,000 euro contribution? Well, the betterment that occurs from the open market value minus the EUV per site from the table on the left, 60,000 minus 20,000 is the 40,000. So what we're saying here is that if we sell a site to the local authority at 20,000 per site, we could have made 60,000 on the market. So there's been a sort of a loss of 40,000, a conceptual loss of 40,000. So if we sell 5 units at that, that would make up your 200,000. So these two figures should equal. They don't always equal. There's more complex cases where equivalent net monetary value come into it, but that will be for another day and another discussion. But in simple terms, that is how you would comply with Part 5 in this sort of case. Just before I hand over to Sheila for some more practical advice on it, this is just a figure that the housing agency provided to us as part of these discussions, and it's regarding the Australian affordable housing contributions. And what's interesting here, if you look at it, the terminology is slightly different than what we'd be familiar with in terms of gross realization value versus our normal gross development value. But it shows the principle of when you work out the gross development value of your product, you take off your taxes and charges, your construction finance and marketing and costs, your developer's margin and profit and risk, and you're left with residual land value. With the affordable housing contribution in the Australian model, and I would stress this is the Australian model, I'm not referring to Part 5 in this case, that it's demonstrating that taxes and charges, construction fee, construction finance and marketing and costs, developers' margin for profit and risk are taken off. The affordable housing contribution reduces residual land value and not specifically any element of developers' margin for profit and risk. The reason I reference this here is that some of you attending the CPD may be involved in Part 5 negotiations directly, but others may just be involved in agency in terms of the sale or purchase of land, or indeed evaluation of land. And it is important to factor in your Part 5 calculations and estimates into your residual valuations to reflect that when you're undertaking those valuations. So that's my last slide, and I will hand over to Sheila to take over from this point.
Hi all, nice to be here today, and thanks to Micheál and to Frank. I'm here to take you through just maybe the process, just the practical elements where a surveyor might be able to assist a client developer and indeed assist the local authority as well to get them through the process, the whole Part 5. So look, initially we'd be talking about as a surveyor how you might assist. I suppose the first thing you might ask on a residential site is your client entitled to an exemption certificate on the development. Currently you can look for an exemption certificate if your development is for 9 or less residential units or for a site area of 0.1 of a hectare. So you make that, you might advise your client to apply for that. Let's assume that doesn't apply in this case. So at pre-planning, I think the first thing you might consider is, when you're thinking Part 5, should your client consider the handover of 10% of the land to the council? The reason you might consider it at this stage is, if your client is open to that, basically the 10% can be included in the curtilage of the site, but no planning permission would be sought on that portion. And the price paid then would be the existing use value of that 10% at the next stage. The other element that your client may be considering is, if you're not handing over 10% of the land, what are the other options? And currently the other options are transfer of the land, as I just said, transfer of other land, transfer of residential units or other residential units, lease of units, or a combination. So that would be at pre-planning discussions with the local authority or the council. The second stage then is your planning application stage. At this juncture, your client is obliged to estimate the cost of the lands for the transfer. If it's existing use value, it's the existing use value only. If you're going for another combination or still considering your options, your client would be obliged to submit an existing use value and an open market value. We'll go into the details of valuation later. I mean, Frank referred to the definitions. We are bound, we're bound by statute, and I think that's very, very much the case. We all are obliged to follow the wording of the definitions. So just to keep that in mind for a later stage. So that's when you're at planning application stage. Of course, even when you're estimating existing use value or open market value, we don't know the final date of valuation. So look, it's an estimate only, and it can be adjusted at a later stage. So it's just the obligation under the latest act is that you have to plan ahead to an extent for Part 5. So then stage 3 is when the planning permission is granted with the Part 5 condition attached. One thing, sorry, I should have said at the outset is these details are all going to be within the SCSI handbook. It's something that you will be able to refer to directly if you have access to that at a later stage. But stage 3 anyway is the planning permission granted with the Part 5 condition attached. The onus is now on your developer client to submit a final existing use value and an open market value figure. Now that you know the date of planning, so you must, you may well want to adjust your figures at this stage. And as I said, we'll go into further detail on, on the valuation aspects. But I think at this stage, primarily, I'd like to refer to a couple of things. The date of valuation for existing use value and open market value that we interpret is the date of final permission granted. But let's say you have a mixed use development. Well, in this case, we would say here that you value your land in its existing use, but you apportion the existing use value to reflect the percentage of residential development on the mixed use site. It's hard to get your head around it, but it makes sense in that you would be apportioning it to the residential development piece only. In terms of open market value on a mixed use site, you would value the residential element only. So the value of the land with planning permission on the residential only. So let's say you have some offices going on or some retail within your mixed use scheme, you ignore the commercial element for the purposes of providing open market value. So also just from a practical point of view, you would be advised to contact the council before you demolish any of your buildings, because just for everyone to, to be fair to both sides, for the council to make a fair assessment of the existing use value, you know, it's appropriate that they should inspect the existing building before you go ahead and demolish it. We've just found sometimes it comes late in the day when the buildings are gone, and it's hard to take it's hard to assess something when it's not there anymore. So just to remind you that really you should be notifying the council before you demolish it. So it's really then a case of discussions between the two sides, and you know, we have found in practice the majority of cases reach agreement. The fourth stage is a dispute. If there is a dispute on property values, either the local authority or the developer can refer the matter to arbitration. Disputes on other matters are referred to on board planola. So as I say, we have, within Dublin, we have had really, really great success in actually achieving agreements. And when both sides, and I would say we as valuers represent a lot of the Dublin counties, let's say, once we reach agreement, we would then report that agreement back to the Part 5 section of the relevant council. Our job really is very much around agreeing existing use value and open market value. And then that is stage 5. It's the Part 5 agreement. Our two figures are taken on board. I mean, Frank went through some examples earlier of existing use value and open market value. Our two figures are then taken on board by the relevant department within the local authority to assess net market value, and they take it to the stage of trashing out which option both sides are happy with. And just to be aware that the transfer of 10% of land is the default option, and the applicant consider that at any stage. And if it's transfer of land only, the valuation required would be existing use value. But all other options require the combination of existing use value and open market value. So I hope that's a help to get just to feed you through. We might just go on, Frank, and just take a look at just to reiterate that on this graph here. We thought it was quite useful. It's quite useful, you know, if anyone is involved in assisting councils even, but also, you know, assisting private clients and developers, just to run through the process. And there's certain stages that you know that you need to give the advice at. You know, you don't want to do anything too late or to advise in retrospect. So I think you can help guide your client developers or the local authority through the process if you go through each step and stage. And this kind of thing is really helpful. As I said before, applicant undertaking residential development is Part 5 apply, the pre-planning consultation, and your planning application stage, the Part 5 proposal, the development, you know, is it going to be granted or refused, and then granted with the Part 5 condition. And this is where you enter into negotiations excuse me, with the local authority, and then you move on to the final agreement, and then it goes back, you know, into that Part 5 section, and it's taken from there. But surveyors can have a very active role in assisting and allowing the Part 5 process go as smoothly and fairly as possible. And then I'll just move on to valuation matters. We talked about this before, and Frank has referred to it. I mean, at the end of the day, it is a statutory valuation, and we are guided by the legislation, by the statutory definition of existing use value. I mean, Frank's graphs are really useful there. Very simple notion of, you know, your piece of agricultural land, you know, the existing use value definition can't be repeated too often. It's the value of the land calculated by reference to the date that planning permission was granted on the basis that it would have been unlawful to carry out any development on the land other than exempted development. So what really we're saying is you have your existing use, and it's, you know, it is a situation here, it's an imaginary situation somewhat, that, you know, you have your petrol station or your pub or your 1980s office, and you cannot, when you're valuing it in its existing use, you have to ignore all zoning, you have to ignore any sort of hope value, and any use that would require planning permission that's not exempt. I mean, we have the case in a residential house, maybe 40 square meters is exempt, so you could consider that, but you can't consider any other use that would require planning permission. And you'd be surprised at the amount of uses that do require planning permission. So it's at its simplest level, giving the developer the benefit of the value of that existing use, and that is what the developer is entitled to. And then the whole idea is to capture the uplift. So when we go on to open market value, and I'll reiterate again, is the value of the land and property with planning permission for residential development in it, residential development attached. In negotiations, it is often referred to as development value, which may confuse, but at the same time, if we just focus in on the wording again, and it's very much an open market transaction. In practice, we rely very much on comparable evidence that is available. If a property is put on the market with planning permission attached, if everyone that is interested in acquiring that land with the planning permission attached has an opportunity to bid for that site, it is that the price achieved as at the valuation date. We do take into account, you know, extraordinary, you know, if there's anything extraordinary about the site, you know, the comparables can be adjusted to allow for that. I mean, every comparable can be adjusted, you know, to get it to zone in as close as you can to the value of the land. Residuals are tricky. We've had very detailed discussions around this. The issue with residuals is there are so many variables in a residual. Each buyer, you know, has its own individual circumstances, whereas when you put a site on the market with that permission in place, and there are no barriers to bidders, you are going to achieve on a particular date the market value of that site. The other element is we find that you know, you would often have sites and comparables being introduced that have no planning permission, whereas that can vary a lot. It can be of significantly more value with planning permission. We would also be valuing a site that is ready to go, ready to move, you know, no delays. So that we think has a positive impact on open market value of those sites as well. So look, we could go on all day about the basis of valuation, and we do get into very detailed negotiations. Each site is individual, has individual characteristics, and you know, we do take each site as each individual Part 5 that comes into the Dublin councils. They're analysed and taken individually and thrashed out in very detailed negotiations to achieve what we both can agree on as being open market value. So look, if there's any questions, and I'm sure there will be, we can certainly take them on board. The details are in the handbooks. But for now, just in conclusion, I'd just like to say that, you know, it's just to give you an all-round view today of the whole process, and I hope it's of some help to you. A one size doesn't fit all. But just to be mindful of the legislation, how it changes all the time, and to be mindful of the process and how we as surveyors can assist right through the whole process. I'm going to hand you back now to Micheál for any questions and answers. Thank you. Bye for now.
Thank you, Sheila, and indeed, thank you, Frank. So we've had the contextual background indeed from Frank, and a very practical step through the process there with Sheila also. So Thank you very much both. And there are questions coming in, so perhaps I will, if you could, and any future questions, just ask which presenter you wish to address the questions to, but I'll take them as we have them on screen at the minute. So the first one I think might be difficult to answer, but maybe Frank, I'll hand it to you first. You mentioned the legislative framework. It says, what will the basis of calculation for the additional 10% affordable provision currently being proposed?
Well, again, it's always a big caveat when you haven't seen the legislation,
exactly.
You know, what exactly it will be, but it's likely that what's in the programme for government, that it will be increased back to the 20%. So assuming that it goes back to the original sort of framework, really you will be increasing what we were referring to as 10% to 20%. So it will be the 20%. Sheila, do you want to come in on that, or is that, I think that's what they're asking?
Sorry, can you repeat the question again there, Micheál?
So effectively the question is, what will the basis of calculation for the additional 10% affordable provision that's currently being proposed? It's been discussed in political circles, you know.
Okay, well, I think it's back to where Frank was saying at the beginning. As valuers, our job is to estimate and agree existing use value and open market value. And then when you take away your existing use value from your open market value, at the moment we multiply that, let's say, by 10%. I mean, this is where it goes into QSs as well, into their realm. But if it's 20%, it would be multiplied by 20% rather than 10%.
Yeah, like going back to 2000 when it was brought in first, there was 20% social and affordable, wasn't there? It was half and half social, half affordable. But I wonder, would the basis of calculation for the affordable be the same as for the current 10%? I presume it probably will, won't it, in terms of how the developer is recompensed for the additional 10%?
Yeah, it's I suppose speculation at this stage. It's not been confirmed, but as I say, I think we all need to focus in on the process. I think it is kind of it goes back into kind of the quantitative error realm and the housing sections within each authority itself, how they then work with that gain. There, there's a certain gain there. So how do they how do they best spend that gain? And it depends on the wording of the legislation as well.
Absolutely. I'd love to talk about specific project with you, Sheila, and dealing with DCC and a negotiation, but I'll restrain myself, and I would ask all attendees to refrain from specific questions, and we'll deal with principles here today. So great. So next one we have there is, do you account for the Part 5 discount on the units when assessing your development value? If it is true open market value, this should be the case. I understand. So when you're assessing the open market value, if it's 100 units, do you value 90 units at X and the remaining 10 at Y? That's an interesting question, actually. Sheila, do you want to go first on that, and then to Frank, seeing as we reverse the order on this question?
Well, again, this is where we come to about valuations and comparables. If you have a comparable site, if Part 5 applies to all sites in a jurisdiction, in the Republic of Ireland. So Part 5 is going to apply to our comparable site as well, unless it's an exempt site. So the same rules apply. So your comparables are very relevant. So if someone is prepared to pay X amount for a site with planning permission for 100 units, they also have to comply with Part 5. So this, the Part 5 applies to both sites. So whatever way you want to compare or analyze your comparables, you can do that. The only other element might be if the existing use value is significantly high on a particular site, you might amend for that. And actually, I do see them on the market. I've actually seen them being advertised that it's almost a plus of a site if it has a high existing use value. You have less of a Part 5 complication there.
Yeah, as a quantity surveyor, that even struck me, that it does depend. Your comparables depends hugely on your existing use value when you're comparing. It's a very case by case basis, really, isn't it? Frank, do you want to add to that?
I have nothing much further to add. I think it's a really good question, and I think Sheila has answered it quite well. I mean, I think where there is a high existing use value, there is a case to be made by the valuer who's acting for the developer to suggest, you know, that should be factored in, you know, and that it should be accounted for in that development value or the open market value.
For sure. Yeah, great question. Okay, how does the equivalent monetary value factor in the amount the local authority pay for the Part 5 units? I think you dealt with that, Frank, initially, so I might put that back to you again, where you had the difference in the site value on existing use and open market value, I think. So I'll hand that back to you.
Yeah, equivalent. So just to clarify for a start, there's, as I referred to in the change in the legislation over the years, equivalent monetary value was an older version of, you know, of the act. There is now an equivalent net monetary value as well. I'm not sure if that's what the questionnaire is about, but if we take it that equivalent to, if what the questionnaire is asking about is what I was presenting on the net monetary value, just in terms of how it impacts into it, you know, I demonstrated there in one of the slides that you can show that discount, you know, through the betterment that's accrued from selling the sites, so through the sites. And if that didn't even out, if it wasn't exactly accurate, then you could factor in the further discounts onto the build cost, you know, from that perspective. So I think that might be what the questioner is asking.
Yeah, so my simple take, because quantity surveyors are very simple, is that if the say there was a number of houses, there was 20,000 between the existing use value and the open market value, and you had a liability, let's say, of 100,000, so you had 5 units and you had 20,000 of a difference between the existing use and the open market value, you would have satisfied. And that would be how you would achieve your net monetary value. In some instances, I suppose you don't get the full 10% of the land that you are entitled to as a local authority, and that can mean, as you say, Frank, an adjustment to the agreed price for the units. Is that a simple?
That's it. Yeah. Thanks for.
Yeah. No, from a QS perspective, we can't follow all this valuation stuff.
I was going to say it's a more QS question, so well done.
I hope that answers the question, but it's an anonymous attendee. Please put in a further question for clarification if you wish. Okay, Sheila, for you, what are the parameters really for providing, well, I think this is for you, for providing alternative units off-site for Part 5?
Now, actually, that is not, believe it or not, that's not a question for me, really. It's actually a question for the relevant local authority.
Right.
I suppose I only know because I've been working with them for a long time, but it falls into their realm again, in that it depends on their own local need, what they need, what they look for. We don't get overly involved. Because, you know, it depends on each local authority's needs at a particular time.
Okay, and can I ask a question just from my own experience then? Like in some instances, if you take Dublin, the units do have to be within the same electoral area. I mean, in the event that it is an option to provide units off-site, do they have to be in the same electoral area as the development site? Is that a?
I'm not 100% sure of that. I've heard of that before. I think you need to consult each local authority again as to what their particular requirements are. I'm not sure if it's governed by statute.
Okay.
But yeah,
okay.
double check that.
Thanks for that, Sheila. Okay, here's one again for you, Sheila. Sorry, can Sheila please clarify that a 40 square meter exempted development only applies to an extension to an existing dwelling if there are no pre-existing building dwelling, that the applicant cannot consider the 40 square meter development as being possible as it's exempt. I'll clarify that a 40 square meter exempt only applies to an.
Now, I think I know what this is. I think and it comes up sometimes with a residential house on an acre of ground, you know, in the Dublin area. Has that property been previously extended? You know, has it? Is there already a 40 square meter extension on it? So each Part 5 is unique. We may well go to the planners and ask them that question. We may well research it ourselves. Has you know, has there been a previous planning permission for a 40 square metre extension? If there hasn't, we could consider it exempt development up to 40 square metres.
Okay, okay, yes, that's, hope that answers the question. It sounds like it, Sheila. Thank you very much. Okay, Frank, I'll divert this one to yourself. For existing use value, do you include the value of the house actual building on the land, or just the land reflecting the use? It goes back to your earlier slides, I think.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Yeah, you value the actual building on the land. It's not just the land. When you're, it goes back to the definition in the Act. So what you're valuing is the existing use on the property, whatever that might be. So if there's a house on the land, you're valuing it as is the house on the land. Similarly, if there was an industrial building on the land, you know, you would value it in the same way as you would value an industrial building. You know, you would go back to your investment method evaluation and you know, look at the rent and the yield and capitalize it that way. So it's the actual building on the land. It's not the land itself when you're estimating the existing use value.
Yeah, yeah.
Can I just add to that as well, and just say that you know, just to be very aware that, you know, if you have a 1980s office block, you are entitled to the existing use value of that 1980s office block, but you have to completely, I suppose, imagine that you can't improve it in any way that would require planning. You know, you can't turn it into a modern office block at that stage, or even with old industrial. Now, that doesn't mean it doesn't have a value. It does have a value, but just within limitations.
And now, Sheila, you can refurb it significantly to upgrade the value, so you put without planning now, will they?
And there's a lot of demand for older industrial as well at the moment. I don't know. I'm not saying that it doesn't have a value.
Okay, no, I hear you. I hear you. Okay, Lena Mulligan Clark, I suspect maybe a QS, I'm not sure, but what developers' builders' profit percentage is usually allowed when agreeing the price of the units being transferred? Sheila, do you want to take that in the first instance?
I think that actually it is more of a QS. It is more of a QS question, and there are some very strict guidelines I know from dealing with the QSs, and there are very strict rules and advice from the housing agency. I would say to go to the handbook. I think has a detailed example of the claimable costs. So I wouldn't feel it's fair for me to comment, because I wouldn't give you the right answer. But there are very clear guidelines on what's allowable.
Yeah. If Frank, you're going to come in there?
Add to it, just to make a comment, and again, I would reiterate, you know, in terms of there is clear guidance and circulars that have gone around over the years, but just to discuss it in a general context. Initially, you know, you would allow a margin similar to what you would allow in a private development, which was going back to 2000 and the earlier years, of the 15% on, you know, on cost. But then the circulars came around, which clarified and appropriately clarified, you know, that because there's less risk involved in terms of a sale to a local authority as opposed to going to the market, that it should be a lower risk, you know, in terms of the margin that's acceptable. So in one of the previous circulars that I'm aware of, and it may not be the most up to date, it was at 7.5% as opposed to your 15% margin, to reflect the fact that it's a lower risk to the developer, and that accounts for it. But as Sheila said, I would point you to the most recent circular, you know, to find that out. But it is relevant particularly when you're looking at residual valuations and stuff like that, for advising clients on current elements and factoring it into your development value.
Absolutely, absolutely, both. And Frank, you're right. It's currently 7.5% on the circulars, and I think that I alluded to inconsistency earlier across the board, but I think that 7.5% has pretty much become the benchmark, being honest. And Lena, to your point in relation to development costs, the guidance is quite clear that the build costs before the addition of the profit should be what the local authority would achieve as if it was to build directly. So if Sheila and team in DCC were to go out to tender to build this a project directly, you would take that would be the benchmark. That's what it would cost to build. Plus, you would get the 7.5% plus all the other add-on costs, professional fees, etc. But there's very good guidance in the circulars and indeed in in our own information paper and etc. So I think it's all there, Lena. Okay, we're getting close to time, but just once I might just pick up a couple of other points, if that's okay. Does retained fabric definition apply to protected structure? I'm not sure who wants to take that.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. A lot of people think retained fabric is protected structure. It isn't particularly. It applies to a lot of protected structures because in a lot of cases the facade is expected to be retained. But it can apply to other buildings where a developer intends on retaining the building and just converting it into residential units. And I think there is one case, Frank, that came up that actually, I think it's an on board Planola case. If anyone is interested, they can email me and I'll give them the reference. It actually teases out the wording of external fabric on a mixed use site where the part of the property was excluded from Part 5 due to the definition. But protected structure, it's interchangeable. Protected structure more than likely will be excluded, but you will have some buildings that are not protected structures but are being retained. So yeah, it's not always the same thing.
Super. Thank you, Sheila. Yeah, appreciate that. And Lena, thanks to you. I think we've answered your question there. You've come back with a thank you. So I hope that, but there's really good guidance out there, and still doesn't prevent debates with in relation to costs. We'll always have those, but it certainly brings a lot of clarity. So here's one for you, which is it's not from me, albeit I'm sitting in a small town in Bunclody, County Wexford at the minute. I'll send this to you, Frank. What if no comparables are available in a small town?
In cases where there's not comparables, you can use alternative methods to supplement it. You know, there usually is some comparables from a comparable level town, but you could use alternatives like residual methods, you know, if that is appropriate in that case to factor it in. You have to remember the definitions in the Act and what they reflect, and if you're looking at the market value, you know, the open market value, you know, how best to value it. So you're really thinking about these things in the same way as you would think about any valuation. You know, how would you approach it with those assumptions in place? And that's really as simple as I can make it. I don't know if you, Sheila, if you want to add to that, perhaps.
Yeah, just you know, absolutely. You can certainly do a check with another method. You know, we do rely primarily on comparables, and a small town. What I might say is that, look, you could look to another similar sized town who, you know, where new house prices are the same or new units are the same. Is it a commuter belt town? Is it a small, you know, is it close to a regional town? What kind of prices are new units achieving? And you could work your way back on that basis. If there were similar sites in other towns where maybe new house units sell at, say, at similar prices. And you know, but you analyze each comparable in detail as well.
Sure. Sheila, do I take it residual is kind of the last option, or the least preferred option, as obviously I'm a quantity surveyor, not a valuation surveyor, but do I take it that comparable is the preferred way to go generally? In
practice, comparable is the preferred method because it kind of trumps if the market is willing to pay a price. And you can analyze your comparables, and you're obliged to analyze each comparable in detail and amend where appropriate. Whereas residual, there are so many elements to a residual that everyone has a different view on, and it can get very complicated in a that statutory framework of market value. You know.
Yeah, no, from the outside looking in as a QS, I could certainly see the difficulty there. Yeah. Last question. Listen, it's been great questions coming in. Very last question. What if permission was granted before the Urban Regeneration Act 2015 and none of the units are suitable for the housing authority? I think, Sheila, perhaps that's you, is it? In the first instance.
Yeah, we had a lot of transitionary cases now. My understanding is, and it goes back quite a long time now, advice did come out within a circular that if a Part 5 agreement was not in place, it would be on the 2015 Act applied, and that the agreement would be based on the date planning permission was granted. So that was where a Part 5 agreement was not in place post 2015. And that was my understanding of any agreements that we dealt with over that time. It's a legal question, but I would lean that direction, that it is that if there is no Part 5 agreement in place when the Act came into being, you apply the Act to as at the date of planning permission grant.
Okay, great. Listen, I think we will have to leave it there. I think Frank and Sheila deserve a glass of water as a minimum. Thank you for the responding. I tried to get in as many questions as I could, so thanks for the quick fire response. And thank you both very sincerely. And I would say, look, as Frank alluded to earlier, these days and these events don't happen by accident. So a big shout out to Edel Ryan and Michelle Smith in SCSI in particular, who are online here working away behind the scenes. So thank you both for that. And to all attendees, I would say, please check all the guidance, check the Part 5 information paper. If you have any further queries, please email them in. Edel will give the email address there, and we will forward them to the relevant personnel if it's Frank or Sheila, or if it's a QS question, and we will have them addressed. But I hope you found today beneficial, and until next time, go make to slán.